So we left chapter 14, we were talking about macroevolution, and macroevolution ends in a new species. So chapter 15, we kind of carry on with this and talk about speciation, what a species is, the different species concepts, and then phylogeny. And phylogeny is really that representation of how things are related to each other. So speciation is the emergence of a new species. Every time we get more species, we increase our biodiversity. It's a word you'll hear in environmental science, and it's an important concept. It might link into that idea that chapter 14 posed. Do you think we're in a mass extinction event? So speciation is increased to biodiversity. There's more species around. We've had millions of species on Earth, and most of them aren't alive anymore, which leads to this idea that they're all linked. So phylogeny is the representation of evolutionary history and relationships. We've seen before a cladogram with some important homologies that shows the links between different organisms. And so phylogeny, we'll also talk about taxonomy as we keep going here. It's really about scientists trying to understand how groups of organisms are related to each other. So taxonomy, like I said, is that part of science that really wants to try and put things into boxes, into categories. And I know if you've ever, filled out a form where you had to put yourself into a series of boxes, often financial forms ask you to put yourself into boxes, you will know that generally life is messy and we don't fit into boxes all that well. So taxonomy is an interesting branch of biology. It is about classifying things. And specifically, we classify them down to a genus and a species. So as an example, we are Homo sapiens. You can hear other sort of like two-part words like this. We have Carolus Linnaeus to thank for this binomial system of naming organisms, where you have both the two kind of branches, and they become more specific. So ancient humans were Homo neanderthalis, Homo uh, um, erectus. There's other species in that same genus, but none of those are alive today. So just as an example. So sometimes we could talk about these different species categorizations. And basically the big thing about this is no one species concept works all the time. So there's some things about species that make them really a lot alike and some that make them very different. So it's really hard to classify these things and fit life into boxes, as you might imagine. The next slide just shows some of those. So, the diversity within humans. There's a lot of diversity out there. We all look very different. I'm pretty sure all of these pictures are stock footage from the 1990s, but they do illustrate a lot of diversity. The other one is that sometimes organisms can look a lot alike. So this is maybe one of the cutest pictures so far, the spotted skunk. One is the eastern and one is the western spotted skunk. Now, to me, they look a whole heck of a lot alike. I'm assuming they smell like a skunk. So I don't think I'd get that close to actually classify these ones. But you can see, yeah, they do look an awful lot alike. So when are these separate species and when are these the same species, right? Generally, what we think about with species is the biological concept of species. And so as an example, we often think that species can't interbreed and reproduce viable offspring, but there's exceptions to these. And so it doesn't take long for you to think of, but wait, what about these things? So wolves and dogs can interbreed. There's an example of polar bears and grizzly bears hybridizing and making, I say this right, Pizzly and Growler bears. And we actually in class were talking, it was not confirmed if their offspring would be, if the Pisleys and the Growlers would be fertile or not. But there's definitely odd exceptions out there, and Pisleys and Growlers. Look at some pictures of them. They're pretty beautiful bears. So these are the concept of species. Probably the big one, the one that you've heard of before, is the biological species concept. So that's the idea that, these individuals can interbreed and produce viable or fertile offspring. We can take a look at other things. So the morphological looks at how they appear. And so how they appear the same or how they appear different. And we use that to say that they're the same species or they're or different species. The ecological species concept, there might be a lot of things alike, but they live in very different worlds. And so they don't interact, they don't interbreed, and then they can't interbreed. So, taking a look at how things live. We could also take a look at a more technical approach. We could take a look at their nucleic acids. We could take a look at their DNA and compare to see how much they're alike and how much they're different. And so that's another way of looking at species to classify them and decide if they are indeed different species or the same species. So kicking it off with probably the biggest one, probably the most uh, relevant one for most organisms, a biological species concept. And so this is what we're talking about. It's a population or a group of populations that members have the potential to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So you might be thinking right now of horses and donkeys and mules, and there you would have the example of an infertile offspring. So mules don't reproduce. All of this, if we were to talk about, what keeps a species, and we will today, reproductive isolation. So reproductive isolation, yeah, sorry. Once we have reproductive isolation, that's going to maintain separate species. And so as we take a look at these reproductive isolation, sometimes we can't actually confirm that. So these are some of the examples why the biological species concept, even though it's probably the one that you would have thought of going into this chapter, they don't always work. What about extinct organisms? We can't tell if Neanderthals and Cro-Magnon man could interbreed and produce viable offspring. We don't know if Homo erectus and Neanderthals could interbreed and produce viable offspring. We have to guess on these. So once an organism is extinct, then we can't use this concept to define them as a species. For humans, we can look at their genotypes, but that's on in another species concept. And what about organisms like a single-celled organism that are asexual in their reproduction? So in these ones, it's not that like we're going to have two individuals coming together to produce offspring, and then is that offspring capable of sexual reproduction? Once we switch things up and have a different process of reproduction, this biological species concept doesn't actually work that well. The other one is hybrid organisms. So sometimes hybrid organisms are like the Pisley and the Growler bears. They can reproduce with each other and produce fertile offspring. And so this is really common in a tropical fish called a cichlid. And a lot of people keep cichlids in-home aquariums and the like. So your textbook really loves talking about cichlids, and I had to learn a whole lot about them because I am not an aquarium keeping person. Okay, so beyond the biological species concept, we'd have the morphological species concept. So a morphology is a physical, observable trait. In genetics, we call those phenotypic traits. They're really just what you can see. We can talk about this morphological species concept, and it's good for asexual organisms. We can take a look at fossils and find evidence in those. And we can basically, kind of apply this species concept to some cases where the biological species concept wasn't working. And so there is a bit of subjectivity. We decide what traits are we going to use, what are we going to actually look at, and oftentimes there are big differences in phenotypic traits that are actually part of the same species. And so this is an example here of ants. Somebody said termites are also a lot like this. You could think of honeybees, where the queen bee is a lot different than the worker bees. They're still the same species, even though their morphology, their observable phenotypic traits are very, very different. So there's a lot of variation, but they are actually the same species. They would abide by the biological species concept. And so as another alternative, outside of the biological species concept and now the morphological species concept, we could talk about that ecological species concept. And so this one takes a look at a species and defines it by its ecological role or the niche that it occupies. And so there's more in our later chapters in ecology, but as an example, again, of this tropical cichlid fish, they have had reproductive isolation because they live in different regions. And so, they can be defined as different species, even if they could be reintroduced to each other and interbreed, they aren't going to interbreed because we have reproductive isolation here for other reasons other than what we've talked about already. So that's the ecological species concept. In a lot of these, I find that it's really handy to have examples because it really kind of brings them to life and allows your brain to hang on to them a little bit more. So probably the most technical approach to defining a species would be to analyze its genes. And so if we take molecular data, so we analyze the DNA, we take a look at the genome of an organism and compare to see how similar or how different they are, then we could define them as either the same species or a different species. So this is called the genealogical or the phylogenetic species concept. And you'd have to sequence the DNA in order to analyze how much they're alike and how much they're different. The final word on species concept is that it's hard. It's messy. We want to put things in boxes, but they just don't seemingly want to go. And so, a specific set of populations can be considered separate species depending on which species concept is used. So this is an example from your textbook, and there's more information in there. In the state of California, there's these salamanders, and they might be able to interbreed with their neighboring populations. But what isn't possible is if they breed across further, then there is not a reproductive, or there is not a viable fertile offspring produced in these. So the question is here, where do we start and where do we stop? Are these two considered the same species? And these two considered, and we just kind of go around? Like, where do we draw the line here? And as you can see, classifying things is messy. So if we move on to talking about what keeps a species separate, we're talking about reproductive barriers. And so reproductive barriers could be classified, I love classifying things, into two things. They could be before fertilization, so this would be a fertilized cell. So there could be barriers before that fertilized cell, or there could be barriers after that fertilized cell. So we talk about these as being prezygotic and postzygotic because they're before the zygote or after the zygote. And there's several mechanisms here. We could talk about temporal isolation, so things that are night blooming and day blooming in flowers. Habitat isolation, a lot like that ecological species concept that we had with the cichlids in the different parts of the lake. We could talk about behavioral isolation, and all of these have some great examples coming up. Maybe it's the courtship ritual of the blue-footed booby or something like that, or mechanical isolation, which I'll talk about sea urchins, which were one of the first ones. And we'll also talk about those, oops, did I miss some down there? Oh yeah, and gametic isolation. Oh, sorry, these are snails actually, and then these are the sea urchins. So after the zygote, we could talk about these ones, and we will as we move through the slides. So in 2 slides, I tried to put these as, from your textbook with fewer words, and then I'll move on to some of the examples because I do find that it's handy to kind of connect these to living organisms, and that's where the world gets weird and wacky and fun to think about and explore. So these would be the prezygotic and now the postzygotic barriers. So those prezygotic barriers, if I were to kind of go through them, would be snakes, and this is really embarrassing because it says terrestrial snakes, or land snakes are terrestrial, aquatic snakes. And so they live in different habitats. And so for that reason, they're not going to interbreed. That would be habitat isolation. Temporal isolation is that the species breed at different times of year or different times of the day. My mom has some night blooming flowers and they literally only come out of their bud in the night and then they wither come the morning time. And so those night blooming flowers are never going to cross pollinate with anything that blooms only during the day. And there's several flowers that only bloom during the day. So that idea of temp in time or in place, there's barriers set up. So these are again prezygotic. There's not going to be a fertilized egg in these organisms. The other ones that are prezygotic would be behavioral isolation. So maybe you don't know the right dance to do if you're a blue-footed booby. And this picture is better than our last one in that those are really blue feet and they're really beautiful birds. So, I don't know if this exists in humans, but you can imagine like a secret code or something. There is mechanical isolation, and this has perplexed me, and I watch snails really, really carefully. Can't remember where I found this. I think it was in the textbook. But snails can be hermaphroditic or are hermaphroditic, but they also have like a side that their genital openings are on, and it's all based on the coil of their shells. And so, there is a possibility that pieces just don't fit together. So mechanical isolation. The last one is on sea urchins. And so this is on a cellular level, gametic isolation in that the male and female gametes, those haploid sex cells, just aren't compatible. They can't come together to make a fertilized egg. And so there's something in the plasma membrane or the structure of the cell that makes it impossible for the sperm to fertilize the egg. And so this is different. It keeps red and blue sea urchins as separate species. Again, this is reproductive isolation. So if there is a zygote formed, so there's a fertilized egg, there are several mechanisms that again prevent gene flow and can lead to speciation. So we could have hybrid inviability. So this is a hybrid is the cross of the two organisms, and basically the tadpoles form, but they don't develop. So tadpoles. Whoops, that doesn't say tadpoles. Tadpoles, but no frogs. And so, yeah, it's after fertilization, but we still don't get adult reproducing organisms. The other one would be mules. And so you're pretty familiar with this, where the mule is the hybrid of two, what we think of as separate species, donkeys and horses. And mules, they're strong, they're capable. In class, we had several stories, good and bad, of mules, but they don't produce more. So they're sterile organisms. The last one here is a hybrid breakdown. And so this is more in plants. And so plants can often become polyploidy. There's more in the slides as we come along here. But this idea that, the parental generation can make an offspring. So kind of grandfather cotton plants can have parent cotton plants. But the parent cotton plants having grandchild cotton plants, this is really hard to say, those ones are feeble or sterile. So it's down a generation. And so, this lineage, if we take a look down, that lineage, that's where things start to break down. So these are all examples of postzygotic barriers. All of the barriers, whether they're prezygotic or postzygotic, can prevent gene flow and lead to speciation. So these are just the pictures. So why would prezygotic mechanisms be less costly than postzygotic? Well, it's because there's no organism formed. There's no energy, there's no resources put into a mule, right? And so that's more effective or less costly for organisms. This prezygotic, postzygotic mechanisms, which would be affected by natural selection? Well, really neither. Or potentially Well, no, neither. Because you don't end up with offspring, right? Like you don't end up with a lineage. And so there's no organisms to get to reproductive age and then produce more. So natural selection is exactly what's not allowed to happen in these. So the mechanisms of speciation, if we do have that reproductive isolation, we could talk about them as being all over the place. So they can have speciation in different areas. We could also have sympatric speciation. So that's speciation in the same area. So allopatric speciation is a fancy word where they're geographically isolated. And I don't know if you could come up with a greater isolating feature other than the Grand Canyon. So the Grand Canyon can separate squirrel species. So this is an example of the squirrel species that are genetically separated because of this geographical barrier. And so in this, each population can be affected, and the allele frequencies can change by natural selection and gene drift. They're isolated from each other. There's a barrier here where there's no gene flow from that other population. The size of that population can also be important, a little bit of a recall. The bottlenecking in the founder effect, that was one of those uh, concepts that were introduced in the last chapter. So that's uh, allopatric speciation. It's where there's physical separation. Sympatric speciation is a little bit sneakier. So this is where the organisms will be living in the same geographical area, but there is some kind of a barrier that prevents gene flow between those populations. So these ones are more common. I'm actually going to start with those in this summary slide. So we get to have habitat differentiation. You know, the birds with the smaller beaks go eat the seeds on the beach, and the birds with the bigger beaks go eat the seeds in the trees. And then eventually, with natural selection, there is gene flow that or genetic drift, sorry, that can end up in differences in those species. The other one would be sexual selection. And so sexual selection really happens when there's a great amount of dimorphism in the sex, the different sexes of an organism, and can actually also be this idea of sympatric speciation. So new species can evolve because of that. So to kick this one off, polyploidy is really common in plants. Now, when we talk about animals and, mitosis and meiosis, things are pretty straightforward. This is nothing that we talked about in our chapter 8. So you can actually end up with not a haploid. You remember haploid were N or 23 in humans. This was haploid. Most of our somatic cells, or all of our somatic cells, sorry, are diploid at 46. And that's the way things were in chapter 8. But now we're saying in plants, things get weird, and you can actually end up with extra chromosomes. So a 2N cell and a 2N cell coming together can make a 4N or a tetraploid or a polyploid plant. And so this is really what that's trying to illustrate. And so, the parent species, the diploid, come together. Um, Oh, what am I doing with this? So the idea here, sorry, I'm lost. I'll just skip to the point of it. The idea here is that this is instantly speciation. This organism here can no longer mate with an organism like that. The gametes coming together wouldn't match up, and they wouldn't be viable. And so this polyploidy is instant speciation. It's really, oh, there it is. Thank you. Read that one. Sorry for getting bongled on that one. So more on polyploids. Hybridization and hybridized polyploids are really, really common. So most polyploids arise from hybridization of two different species. In this one, a haploid gamete can form two different species to produce a sterile hybrid. And it says, why is the hybrid sterile? And here, There's the answer right there. Chromosomes can't pair up, so you can't have meiosis. How could it reproduce? Well, it could reproduce asexually. And we think mostly of plant cells, they're eukaryotic cells, and I've been talking about how they are sexually reproducing, but there's a lot of plants that reproduce asexually. So if you take a root cutting or a leaf cutting from a plant and propagate it that way, that would be asexual reproduction. And so in this, plants are super cool, and there's lots of variation in them. Actually, 80% of all living plants are descended from a polyploid speciation. And so this is really common. We've got lots of foods we were talking about in class, how it's most of the foods that I'd kind of eaten that day: oats, potatoes, bananas, peanuts, plums, apples, uh, sugarcane, coffee, wheat. I mean, cotton is also a polyploid. There's a lot of polyploid species, and this might very well be the first you've ever heard of polyploid plants. So the advantage here to hybridization is that we increase genetic variation. And we know that genetic variation is kind of that like um, material for evolution. So if you increase genetic variation, there are more traits that might be fitter or offer reproductive advantage in a species. So sympatric speciation in animals more commonly happens through habitat differentiation or sexual selection. And so these are kind of explained a little bit here. Again, going back to those colorful fish living at different parts of the lake and, ending up in the same lake but being different species. So speciation in the same area. Sexual selection, again, with the good old little cichlids or fish, the choice that they make with the colors of the male and repeatedly males or females choosing males with specific colors can isolate the different groups. The next slide is about an experiment that was outlined in your textbook about, diets. Well, I'll talk about that in a minute, sorry. So reproductive barriers can evolve as the populations diverge. All of these are what we've talked about before. And here it is, the example of the fruit flies. So from your textbook, this talks about a group of fruit flies that are fed a starch diet and a group of fruit flies that are fed a maltose diet. And so when they controlled the food, the mating pairs actually there was selection to have a common diet. Without controlling the diets of the population, there was more random mating. And so if you give them a little bit of everything, then you're going to have a little more randomness in those matings. And so this is an example of how the environment can shape the genetic interactions of different organisms. So the last part of our notes here is about hybrids, and we'll wrap up our topic on evolution. So hybrids are really cool. We've already talked about a bunch of hybrids, the idea of Paisley bears and Growler bears, and how these things can kind of diverge, all of these barriers that kind of like, cut off gene flow. The hybrid zone is where they interact again. And so if the hybrids come back together and reestablish gene flow, it's really interesting to study what happens in these areas. We could have a reinforcement where the bears were like, no, I am good. I'm going my own way and I'm going my own way. So there's, more difference between them. We'd have stability where the species stay about the same, somewhat unaffected by the hybrid zone there. Or we could have fusion where we have kind of the reversal of speciation where two species become one again. And lots of cool things to study out there with these ones. Speciation, again, it's hard to get your head around how long a time scale we're talking about. It can happen relatively quickly or relatively slowly. So we're talking about 4,000 to 40 million years. I can't even get my head around 4,000 years probably. You could talk about two different models, and both of these models are proven to be true. So the gradualism model is that incremental change, where the punctuated equilibrium model is a vast change as we move. Like so, they deviate and then they stay this, and so it's not a gradual; it's a pretty rapid deviation there. Just to remind us, there are so many misconceptions about evolution. Again, I am not evolving, you are not evolving, but a population can evolve. So population is an important measure. The other thing is that species are not goal oriented. We're not working towards perfection. They don't evolve because of need. Biological diversity exists and the environment selects. And evolution is not plan oriented or deliberate. It's only reactive to the change in the world around us. And it can only work on what is there. And so in this, just to remind us on those things that evolution is something that's commonly misunderstood, I hope you have a better understanding of evolution.